I never thought I'd find myself in this position. My husband Carson was the man I vowed to love forever, the one person I thought I'd never hurt. But temptation got the better of me. My affair with Austin wasn't about love, it was an escape. A rush, something I convinced myself was harmless. At the time, it felt exciting. I told myself it was just a distraction, something that didn't mean anything, but deep down, I knew better. Carson and I had been together for years, and somewhere along the way, our marriage started to feel routine. We weren't unhappy, but the passion we once had began to fade. It was subtle at first: missed date nights, quick kisses instead of lingering ones, conversations that became more about logistics than feelings. I didn't notice how distant we had grown until it felt too late to bridge the gap. Then came Austin, a man I'd known in college who reappeared in my life unexpectedly. It started innocently enough, just casual messages, catching up on old times. But those conversations quickly became more frequent, more intimate. Austin had a way of making me feel seen, of reminding me of the person I used to be before marriage, before responsibilities. He flattered me, told me things I hadn't heard in years, and I soaked it all in. I wish I could say I tried to resist, but I didn't. I leaned into the attention, telling myself it wasn't a big deal. After all, it was just texts, right? But those texts turned into phone calls, and those phone calls turned into plans to meet. The first time I met Austin in person, I told myself it was just two friends reconnecting. But when I saw him, the boundaries blurred, and before I knew it, I had crossed a line I swore I'd never cross. The affair didn't last long, just a few weeks, but it was enough to destroy everything I had with Carson. Every moment I spent with Austin felt like I was living a double life, one where I could pretend to be someone else entirely. But the guilt always lingered, gnawing at me every time I came home to Carson. He didn't suspect a thing, which only made it worse. He trusted me completely, and I used that trust as a shield to hide my betrayal. The day Carson found out was the worst day of my life. He came across a text I forgot to delete, a message from Austin that made it clear what had been going on. I'll never forget the look on Carson's face when he confronted me. It wasn't anger, it was pain. Deep, soul-crushing pain. He didn't yell, didn't scream. He just stood there, staring at me like he didn't recognize the woman he married. When he finally spoke, it was with a quiet finality that shattered me. He packed a bag and left, leaving me alone with the silence and the weight of what I'd done. I wanted to chase after him, to beg for forgiveness, but I knew it was too late. I had broken something that might never be fixed. And the worst part, I couldn't blame anyone but myself. After Carson left, the silence was deafening. The house we had shared felt empty, hollow, and cold. Every room was a reminder of him, of us, and of what I had destroyed. His favorite coffee mug sat untouched on the counter, and the blanket he always used was draped over the couch where we used to sit together. Now, all of it felt like relics of a life I had ruined with my selfishness. I didn't know how to function without him. Every moment was consumed by the weight of my guilt, the reality of what I had done. I had betrayed the man who had stood by me through everything, the one person I thought would always be there. And now he wasn't. Austin tried to reach out a few times. At first, he sent texts asking if I was okay. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The thought of talking to him made me feel physically ill. What we had wasn't love, it was a mistake, one that cost me everything I held dear. I deleted his messages and blocked his number, hoping it would bring me some sense of relief. It didn't. The days blurred together. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Carson's face, the pain in his eyes when he confronted me. I kept replaying that moment in my head, wishing I could take it all back, wishing I had never let things get this far. But no matter how much I wished, I couldn't change the past. I started to realize just how much I had taken Carson for granted. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he loved me in a way that felt safe and unwavering. He was always there, even when I didn't deserve it. And instead of appreciating that, I let myself get caught up in the thrill of something new, something fleeting. I traded the stability of his love for a fantasy, and now I was left with nothing. My family and friends noticed something was wrong. They asked questions, tried to get me to open up, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How could I admit that I had destroyed my own marriage? That I was the villain in my own story? So I kept it to myself, carrying the weight of my mistakes alone. Weeks passed, and the emptiness only grew. I missed Carson more than I thought possible. I missed his laugh, his presence, the way he made me feel like everything would be okay, even on the hardest days. I knew I didn't deserve a second chance, but a part of me couldn't stop hoping for one. Then one day Carson reached out. When I saw his name on my phone, my heart stopped. I stared at the screen, afraid to answer, but even more afraid to let the call go to voicemail. Finally, I picked up, my hands trembling. He said he wanted to meet, that we needed to talk. I didn't know what to expect. Was he ready to forgive me? Or was this the end, the moment he officially closed the door on us for good? Whatever it was, I knew I had to face it. I owed him that much. When Carson agreed to meet, I was overwhelmed with a mix of relief and dread. Relief because this was the first glimmer of hope I'd had since he left, and dread because I didn't know what he would say. Was he meeting me to tell me it was truly over? Or was there a small chance he might give me another shot? The days leading up to our meeting felt endless. I replayed every possible scenario in my head, imagining all the ways the conversation could go. I prepared myself for anger, for tears, for indifference. I rehearsed apologies, trying to find the perfect words to convey how deeply sorry I was, but no matter what I came up with, nothing felt like enough. When the day finally arrived, I could barely breathe. My heart pounded as I sat at the cafe where we agreed to meet, watching the door for any sign of him. When Carson walked in, my chest tightened. He looked different, colder, more distant. There was no trace of the warmth I had always associated with him. Instead, he carried himself with a calm, almost chilling composure that unnerved me. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I wanted to reach out to grab his hand and beg for his forgiveness, but I knew that wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want empty words or gestures. He wanted something real, something that would make up for the pain I had caused. Carson broke the silence first. He told me he had thought long and hard about what he wanted, about whether our marriage was worth saving. Hearing those words from him was like a knife to the chest. The thought that he had even considered giving up on us broke me, even though I knew I had given him every reason to. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. He told me he was willing to give me a second chance, but it wouldn't come without a price. At first, I didn't understand. I thought he meant counseling or complete transparency, things I had already prepared myself for. But what he wanted was something I never expected. He said that if I wanted to stay in this marriage, I needed to prove my commitment to him in a way that left no room for doubt. He wanted me to make love to him, but not in private. He wanted it to happen in front of Austin. I was stunned. For a moment, I thought he was joking, but the seriousness in his eyes told me otherwise. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what he was asking of me. It felt humiliating, degrading, and completely out of character for the Carson I thought I knew. But at the same time, I understood why he was doing this. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. Carson had been humiliated, betrayed, and stripped of his trust in me. This was his way of forcing me to confront the consequences of my actions in the most vulnerable and raw way possible. He wanted Austin to see that I belonged to him, that the bond between us was unshakable. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to refuse, to walk away and avoid the shame of it all. But another part of me knew that if I truly loved Carson and wanted to save our marriage, I had to do whatever it took. This was the price of forgiveness, and I had to decide if I was willing to pay it. Carson's ultimatum haunted me in the days that followed. I couldn't escape the image of him standing there, calm and composed, while he told me what he needed from me. At first, I told myself that I could find another way to prove my commitment to him. Maybe we could try couples therapy or take a break from everything and focus on rebuilding trust. But deep down, I knew that was never going to be enough for Carson. He wasn't looking for words, he was looking for an act, something that would show him that I understood the weight of what I'd done. And in some twisted way, I knew that what he was asking for was the ultimate test. I had always believed that there were limits to how far a person should go for forgiveness, but Carson had shattered that belief. This wasn't about just fixing a broken marriage, it was about proving, in the most vulnerable way possible, that I was his and that nothing, not even my betrayal, could take that from him. The thought of performing the act Carson wanted, making love to him in front of Austin, was beyond humiliating. It was more than just physical. It felt like an invasion of everything I had once considered sacred about intimacy. But I also knew that the person I had hurt the most wasn't Austin. It was Carson. He was the one who had given me everything, and I had ripped it all away. If this was what he needed to feel like I was truly sorry, could I really refuse? I spent days wrestling with the decision. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The thought of facing Austin again made my skin crawl. After everything that had happened, the last thing I wanted was for him to be a part of something so intimate, something so raw. But Carson's words kept echoing in my mind. He needed to see that I belonged to him, that I was his, and this was the only way he could regain the control I had stolen from him. Finally, I agreed. Carson made all the arrangements, contacting Austin to let him know what would happen. It felt strange, almost surreal, to think that in just a few days, I would be sharing something so private with both of them. The thought made me sick, but the thought of losing Carson for good was worse. When the day came, I was a bundle of nerves. I felt like I was walking into my own punishment, and every step toward that moment was like a slow march to the inevitable. Carson was cold, distant, and I didn't know if it was a defense mechanism or if it was the beginning of the end for us. His eyes, which had once been full of warmth, now seemed calculating, almost as if he was preparing himself for what was about to happen. Austin was already there when I arrived. He sat in the corner, looking uncomfortable and unsure, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. He had to know what was going on, had to understand that this was my attempt at redemption, though part of me knew that it wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Carson and what he needed from me to heal. I stood there, frozen, as Carson gave me a single, unreadable look. There was no warmth in it, no forgiveness in his gaze, but there was a command. It wasn't the Carson I had known, and that scared me. But I had agreed to this, and now there was no turning back. As much as it terrified me, I had to prove to him that I was willing to do anything to make up for what I had done. The room felt suffocating, and I didn't know what was more humiliating, the act itself or the knowledge that I had allowed it to come to this. I could only focus on the pain in Carson's eyes, the betrayal I had caused, and the price I was paying to try and fix it. It wasn't just about sex, it was about reclaiming something I had broken beyond repair. The moment it was over, everything felt different. The room was suffocating, and I could barely catch my breath. My mind was reeling, but strangely, there was a sense of finality. Carson had made his point, and I had given him what he asked for. But it didn't feel like a victory either for him or for me. It was as though everything had been stripped away, leaving nothing but raw, exposed emotions. The shame, the guilt, the hurt, it was all there, swirling around us in the air. When it was done, Carson's gaze was still cold, but there was something else beneath it, something that seemed to have shifted. He didn't look at me with disgust, but there was no warmth either. His eyes were hard, like he had regained control of something he had lost, but the connection we once had felt almost like a distant memory. Austin didn't say a word. He quietly got up and left, his face unreadable. I had never felt so humiliated in my life, but at the same time, part of me felt like I was finally confronting the consequences of my actions. This wasn't just some simple mistake anymore, it was something that would forever change everything. It was painful, but it was also a reckoning. Carson didn't speak as Austin left. There was no moment of reconciliation or understanding. Carson just stood there for a moment, staring at me as if he were taking in everything that had happened, everything I had done to him. I wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words felt useless. How could I fix this? How could I make up for what I had done? Carson finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but firm. This is the last time, he said. There was no anger, no yelling, just a cold finality in his words. I won't tolerate anything like this again. If you want this to work, you need to understand what's at stake. I nodded, barely able to keep it together. He was right. I had crossed a line, and now we both had to live with the consequences. The part of me that wanted to fight, to tell him how sorry I was almost drowned out by the reality of what had happened. He had given me a chance, an impossible, painful chance, but I knew that this wasn't some simple fix. Carson's next words, though, made me pause. He looked at me with a kind of hardness that I couldn't remember seeing before. We move on from this, or we don't, he said. There's no in-between anymore. I wasn't sure what that meant for us. Could we really move past this? Was forgiveness even possible after everything I had done? I wasn't sure, and part of me feared that no matter how much I wanted to make it work, we might never return to the way we once were. But I knew one thing for sure: this experience, no matter how painful, had forced me to face the truth. I had destroyed the trust we had built over years, and no amount of apologies or attempts to fix it could change what had already happened. The question now wasn't whether we could move forward, it was whether Carson could ever look at me the same way again. As I stood there, silently processing everything, Carson turned and walked toward the door. Before he left, he looked back at me once more, his face unreadable. I hope this was worth it, he said quietly, before leaving me alone with my thoughts and the mess I had created. And as the door closed behind him, I was left standing in the aftermath, unsure of what the future held, but knowing that the cost of forgiveness was more than I had ever imagined.